Hello, everybody. Welcome to another live stream for the History Valley podcast. Today, I'm joined by Dr. Brad H. Young. And today, we're going to be talking about his views on the synoptic problem. And I'm going to show some slides. And these slides are going to be based on his book here, Jesus and His Jewish Parables. So welcome to the History Valley podcast, Professor Young.
Well, thank you, Jacob. It's so wonderful to be here with you. Your podcast is reaching so many people. I think this is a really important area of study today.
Thank you. So I'm going to start with this slide. That's his book again, the same one I just showed on the screen. And there on the right is a link to purchase his book on Amazon. There are other websites, but Amazon seems to be where most of the copies are currently. So that's why I just put the link to Amazon. But I want to start us out with Mark and expansion, because in page 140 in the book, you talk about that it would be very strange if Mark was being abbreviated by Matthew and Luke when it comes to the Gadarene demoniac. And you were saying it kind of makes better sense if Mark was actually expanding what Matthew and Luke were talking about regarding the Gadarene demoniac instead.
Yes, this is very fascinating. One of the foundations of synoptic problem, so when we talk about the synoptic problem, we're saying that when we study the Gospels, seeing them together, the word synoptic means seeing together, sun opsis, synoptic, is that there's clearly an interrelationship between the three Gospels. There are similarities of wording, and then there's divergences. And the most prevalent view that's accepted today is that Mark was the first of the three gospel writers. And one of the foundation pillars is that he is the shortest. And certainly, I think that when we look at the Gospel of Mark in length, it's 16 chapters. Obviously Matthew and Luke are much longer. But if we study the individual story units, for instance, the demoniac or even the parable of the mustard seed, you will see that Mark is actually the longer of the three stories and seems to actually add some vivid detail. My friend David Biven, great synoptic scholar in Jerusalem, worked a lot with the Jerusalem Perspective, wonderful magazine, great website with much information from Jewish scholars in Israel, international scholars. He looked at Mark as kind of a targumist. That is, Mark sometimes would amplify certain aspects. He would maybe change the wording a little bit. And Dr. Robert L. Lindsey, veteran scholar in Jerusalem, commented on this. So, for instance, when we talk about the parable of the mustard seed, Mark adds this idea that's the smallest of all seeds. But, it's a little bit different there. We also have, a few more details in the demoniac of the malady and the results that don't actually find representation, the parallels in Matthew and Luke. I think another aspect of this, Jacob, is, the linguistic foundation, because we have very early patristic witnesses. Papias, we usually look at as maybe even the earliest patristic witness about the Gospels. And he commented that Matthew wrote the Gospel in the Hebrew language. Now, there are some scholars that say that when it says Hebreus dialecto, that it's in Greek, that it's actually referring to Aramaic. I would probably take issue with that. I do think that we'll see that Aramaic and Hebrew are similar languages, and sometimes there are loan words from Aramaic into Hebrew, loan words from Hebrew into Aramaic. There are also loan words from Hebrew into the Greek New Testament. So I think we see a multilingual background, but I think when Papias says Hebrew language, he's probably thinking more of Hebrew. Now, I don't want people to think that I'm actually talking about our Matthew with the Papias tradition. What we see is that there is a common source to the three Gospels that comes from this Hebrew document. And so when we look at the Hebraisms in Matthew and Luke, they're much more precise, much more pronounced than what we find in Mark's text, which seems to be stylized at certain points, like the smallest of all seeds, or the green grass, for instance. In Hebrew, we would probably just say grass, but we have this detail coming from Mark, and probably this was very helpful for his audience that he has in mind, that he's writing to. But what we're trying to do in our study of the parables and this linguistic background, my first book on the parables, Jesus and his Jewish parables, we worked a lot with the method of how to study the parables. And I wrote a second book about the parables, Jewish tradition, Christian interpretation, which focus more on how to apply that method to the parables of Jesus. And I actually also wrote, in my book, Jesus, the Jewish Theologian, on some parables that maybe I don't have as much in these others. Jesus and his Jewish parables, one parable that I really studied a lot was a parable of the wicked husbandman. I like to call it the parable of the only son. Some call it the parable of the vineyard. But I would prefer that we would see the focus on the son, the only son of the vineyard owner. But in that parable, sometimes we see this emphasis on what we now are talking about as replacement theology, supersessionism, triumphalism. Some people even want to call it now fulfillment theology. And what I think we see when we put this in the context of the life and ministry of Yeshua is that he was thinking of this final week, and it was really a parable about him and his task and his consciousness and reaching out for reconciliation, healing, redemption, even being involved with some of the Sadducean priests that were collaborating with the Romans against him. But certainly, you're asking these really important questions. So is Mark the shortest gospel? He's the shortest in length. But is he really the shortest gospel when we look at the individual story units? Well, sometimes he's expanding it. Sometimes he's giving more explanation, more understanding. And the study of Lindsey, Flusser, Vivian, others, I've been involved in this for many years. We tend to feel like Mark is a little more stylized in Greek. Some scholars even talk about Mark's Greek as being a little bit primitive. I mean, he has a way of expressing himself, and he's communicating with his audience. He's emphasizing the action of Jesus. He's emphasizing some aspects of this ministry. And it's interesting to see this in the synoptic parallels.
How do you look at the nativity stories in Matthew and Luke? Some scholars will say Mark has to be the first gospel because, well, it doesn't include a nativity story. It also doesn't include the unique sayings of Jesus in Matthew and Luke. Matthew and Luke got that from the Q document, and they use those things as arguments that Mark is first. But how do you look at that?
One question would be, when we talk about the message of redemption and the larger context in ancient Judaism, well, our model is the life of Moshe. And of course, we have, a lot in Exodus, the Torah, teaching us about the birth of Moses. I would also point out that when we look at the birth narratives, especially in Luke's gospel, that they are very Semitic. Even C.C. Torrey, who kind of started out with this Aramaic theory, he felt like the first two chapters of Luke were derived from a Hebrew source. We actually discussed in Jerusalem at times if perhaps this source could have been related to the life of John the Baptist, because we also have parallels to John the Baptist's birth. Yochanan HaMatbil, here, the Yochanan, the immerser, he is, his birth has importance with the way that it's connected to lay the foundation, prepare the way for the ministry, the career of Yeshua. So I think we do see some precedents that you would naturally have some of these birth stories. Matthew, of course, emphasizes a little bit more from the standpoint of Joseph, and we're hearing some of Joseph's perspectives. We have the genealogy. This is one thing that I felt was so important in our new translation of the Hebrew Heritage Bible, Newer Testament, because we can see there that the very first verse of the first book of the New Testament, I like to call it, we've called it the Newer Testament, to emphasize the interconnection with the Older Testament. Sometimes you say Old Testament in English, you're really saying old, outdated. Older kind of has that idea of vintage, and people understand what you're talking about. I like to speak about the Tanakh, of course, or the Torah, the Nevi'im, the Ketuvim. But you see this interconnection that in the Newer Testament you're seeing this interconnection, and there, of course, you're starting with the family of Yeshua. I think sometimes when people look at it strictly from a believers, Christian perspective, they want to say, well, he's the Ben David. But actually what we're seeing in the genealogy of Matthew is that he is the Ben Avraham. He's the son of Abraham. And Abraham was a father of Yitzchak, and Yitzchak was a father of Yaakov. Yaakov was a father. We see this going right down to the brothers of Yehudah. So the very beginning of the gospel story, and this seems to be very Hebraic, based on 14 generations, probably similar to, connected to the numeric value of David in Hebrew, which is 14, but it is beginning with Israel. Israel is the start. It's the family story. And so one of the difficulties we have in translation is that we have a change of family, we have a change of language, we have a change of culture. And I think today, to really understand these stories and the unfolding of the gospel, we really need a change of heart. Our Newer Testament translation emphasizes the first century Jewish context so that we can hear as the disciples heard. And so here you have the beginning. I would even say, Jacob, if we look at the story of Israel, why is it so important? I love the way that Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sachs wrote in an article not long before his death. He was saying, well, the first time we have reconciliation in the world, we never have that in the ancient Near East. We usually have revenge or something. Here, Joseph's brother sold him into slavery and meant all this evil for him. But in the end, what is the story? Healing, reconciliation. And I think that's why the Gospels begin with Yisrael. Yeshua is Ben Avraham, Ben David. And we see this connection really all through the Newer Testament, if we study Romans, if we study Revelation. But coming back more specifically to your question, the birth stories were very important for the Jewish context, the Jewish environment, connecting it with the prophetic outlook, the connection with Israel's history and Israel's story, and the family of the people of Israel, that Yeshua is family. And Mark is, I think, written more with the non-Jew in mind, and he's talking about the miracles of Jesus. I would argue that if we would look at Mark, there are some allusions, to the teachings, and yet he doesn't fully elaborate on the teachings. But in Matthew's gospel, for instance, that better replicates, reproduces these Hebrew sources that we have in early church tradition. I might Might add that James Edwards' recent book, The Hebrew Gospels, a very good book, discusses 13 different patristic witnesses. There are more than that, but they seem to be, there seems to be a knowledge that there was a Hebrew gospel, Hebrew traditions. We know that Jewish believers had a prominent role. Eusebius, in his ecclesiastical history, mentions leaders of the early Jerusalem church all have Jewish names till the time of Hadrian, when the Jewish people were forced out of Jerusalem. But we see these interconnections with Hebrew language. The birth of Jesus, I think, has similarities to the birth of Moses, but it has connections with the birth of John the Baptist. So we see this birth narrative setting the stage, preparing the hearts of the people. And I think one thing also that's very exciting, when we're looking at the first century context, is the importance of the temple. Prophets, prophetesses, Navi, speaking words over the baby Yeshua. We see prophetic words uttered over Yochanan HaMatbil, so that you kind of see this development of who later, Yochanan HaMatbil later is referred to as Eliyahu, Elijah, who was coming to prepare the way. And then Yeshua is talking about how the kingdom is powerfully breaking its way forward. I know some translations, the King James and the RSV, some tend to say the kingdom suffers violence and the violent take it by force. In our Newer Testament, I think it's much better to translate with the active meaning of biadzamai, that the kingdom of heaven is powerfully breaking its way forward, and forceful people are seizing hold of it, so that there is that sense that this movement of the kingdom is here. It's working. It's breaking its way forward, and people are involved in it. The disciples who are following Yeshua, putting his teaching into practice, are involved, and they are the poor in spirit. So Mark's gospel is a little more concise. I know one of the things I sometimes read in scholarly literature about Mark is that the gospel ended in verse 8 and doesn't mention the resurrection. And they'll want to say, well, Mark is like the Gospel of Thomas, where sometimes scholars are claiming the Gospel of Thomas is kind of a sayings gospel. I think Timothy Schramm, we could talk about this, demonstrated that actually the Gospel of Thomas should not be considered a source of the Synoptic Gospels, but he's, quoting the Gospels. He knows the Gospels in Greek. He doesn't have knowledge or connection to these Semitic sources. And they say, well, Gospel of Thomas doesn't emphasize resurrection, so Mark doesn't emphasize resurrection. But the first 8 verses of Mark obviously testify to the resurrection of the Lord and gives a commission of the witness. I like now where we go to Israel, we have the recent excavations at Magdala. As a matter of fact, Jacob, I was a volunteer for a short time working on the excavations at Magdala this summer, just about 2 weeks ago. And I also had the opportunity of volunteering in the excavations at Tel Araj, which is probably our original site for Beit Saida, though there is an alternative site a little further away from the lake. Many feel like it's too far away from the Sea of Galilee to have had a port, to be a port city. But both of these sites are being excavated now. But I think it's clear now with the publication of the work by Mordecai Aram, who is heading up this excavation, along with Stephen Notley from Nyack College, who's a great historian, great author, very dedicated to this archaeological work. But now with the inscription found in the mosaic floor of a Byzantine chapel, it seems clear that this area was identified with the hometown of, the life of Simon Peter, which we often in the past have associated with Capernaum. Certainly, we have the story of Peter's mother-in-law in Capernaum. And I think we should kind of see maybe a little triangle. You know, we've got Bethsaida, we have Capernaum, we have Chorazin, these cities in which Jesus was ministering in. We have, you know, this miracle stories of Yeshua. I think it's important to kind of connect these miracle stories with what we know about Yeshua and the connections with the Hasidim, this subgroup within the movement of the Pharisees that emphasize prayer, healing, and you know, even in some of the extra biblical references that we have to the disciples of Yeshua, even you know, Talmudic references or others, that they're understood to be those that pray for healing and you know, have innovative teachings that help solve some of these issues. So I think when we look at the whole story, that these the Gospel of Luke giving us the perspective of the birth narratives from Miriam, the mother of Jesus, and then the perspective of Joseph, and then we have these genealogies, we have this story. It begins to fit together into more of a biography of the one who is likened to Moses, and I think is, you know, a theme that we have in the Gospels, kind of a different sub themes that we have coming out. Some say this might be the Gospel writers or the Hebrew Gospel. I think there are sometimes we can see connections even to the sayings of Jesus, the thought of Yeshua, a self-awareness that he possessed. Certainly, if we connect the parable of the only son in the final week, the parable of the vineyard, this would show a high self-awareness of Yeshua and his understanding of his task, his mission, the messianic anointing that he had received.
What does the variations of agreement between Matthew and Mark, which I have in this slide right here, this is from your book, page 149, figure 1. What does this demonstrate?
The connection between Matthew and Mark is very important for understanding the synoptic relationships. This was the discovery of Dr. Robert Lindsey, and he wrote about it in his book, which was a Hebrew translation of the Gospel of Mark, but it was an introduction to the synoptic problem, and it was based on another article that he worked on in Novum Testamentum, of course, a very fine peer-reviewed journal, and also in collaboration with Professor David Flusser, accepted this approach. David Flusser wrote about this in a Hebrew book that was edited by Chana Safrai, and I think it's a very good overview of the synoptic problem. Of course, all these things are kind of in my book, but you're asking the specifics. So let me say that what we found with Matthew is that he tended to copy his sources very carefully. And what we found is that when he had a source in common with Luke from what we believe is this Hebrew gospel, something that was very Semitic, easy to translate from Greek into Hebrew. And, you know, I think that would also be true in Aramaic if you're one of the Aramaic theorists. You know, it's a Semitic text that Matthew and Luke show almost complete identity in wording with one another when they are sharing this common source that we believe they are quoting. It's a little more complicated than that, but this is really important that we see this double tradition between Matthew and Luke for their curve. However, when you have Mark in between Matthew and Luke, we see that Matthew tends to highly regard Mark in some of his additions, so that he will quote Mark more carefully and add some of the what we call the Targumus additions in the wording from Mark. He will incorporate it into his gospel. At the same time, he'll be quoting what we call this common source between Matthew and Luke that shows more of the Hebraic meaning of the text. So what Lindsey called, he liked to call this the Mark and cross factor. I mean, what's the difference between these texts where Matthew and Luke show a high identity of wording, almost, over 90% in some of these texts, many of these texts of the double tradition. And then a low verbal identity, and Matthew seems to have more of a connection to Mark. It's Mark. Mark is the cross factor, and even where we have the three texts together, what we have is what we call minor agreements in wording between Matthew and Luke. These minor agreements have been written about, discussed by Nyarnik, a really good book that illustrated a lot of them. I might not always agree with his conclusions or his interpretations, but he presents the evidence. And I would say, Jacob, when we talk about the synoptic problem, the most important thing that we need to understand is the evidence. Most people want to know, well, what's the final conclusion? So people start out with Mark and priority as a final conclusion. I think that my book, Jesus, the Jewish Theologian, opened some new insights into Jesus because we emphasize the evidence. And I think because we were taking the traditions from Luke very seriously, not like some scholars that say, well, Luke is a secondary expansion, it's unreliable. Only Mark is the only really reliable source for the life of Jesus. But no, the method that we're using is that we see a Hebrew source, we see linguistic background. We're trying to find the Jewish connections. How did the first disciples understand these sources? So we see that in the three Gospels, but we really listen to it. So I think Jesus, the Jewish Theologian, my book, had a certain appeal to many readers because it gave you more of a Lukan understanding or viewpoint of Jesus, in some respects. When Albert Schweitzer wrote his classic book, translated in English, The Quest for the Historical Jesus, he started from a Matthean priority. And most books today start from the idea of a Markan priority. So, they minimize the genealogies or the birth narratives. Well, if we see the birth narratives, especially in Luke's gospel, as showing Semitic text, well, that would be evidence that's a very firm tradition. Now, I've written 2 books about the parables, and I've tried to bring out the linguistic background in the parables, and I find that they are very, very connected to Hebrew and also very connected to this genre of teaching in the rabbinic literature. As a matter of fact, the only place we find mishalim, parables, story parables like the Gospels, are in rabbinic literature. And sometimes we find some really great parallels. I think one that just has always been meaningful to me when I was studying the rabbinic parables in comparison to the parables of Jesus is this curious phrase in the parable of the prodigal son. I like to call it more of the compassionate father and the 2 lost sons, because I think both of them were lost in a different way from their father. And the story is about reconciliation of fellowship with the Father. What does forgiveness and reconciliation look like? But there is this phrase when the younger son who sold everything, wanted his inheritance, he's really just telling his dad, drop dead, I want your money. And then he goes away into a far country. A thing that we find also in some rabbinic parables of the son of a king, where he goes into evil ways and he's called back. Well, in one of these parallels, you have a similar phrase in what I'd call rabbinic Hebrew, Mishnaic Hebrew, that we have also in Luke's gospel, because the gospel says, here's the phrase I've been talking about that kind of uses as an illustration, where it says, he came to himself. The young boy that had run away from home, he came to himself. And then he says, I will arise and I will go to my father. Well, this is the perfect image and description of repentance in a Jewish context. Repentance is tshuva. It's more than just changing your mind. When we talk about in Greek metanoia, which is important to change your mind, but it's a return. It's going back home. It's becoming who you were meant to be in the household of the Father. So But it says he came to himself. Well, this is a difficult phrase in Greek. People have discussed it a lot. But when you look at the rabbinic parables, and I wrote about this especially in my second book, Parables, Jewish Tradition, Christian Interpretation, you'll see that this phrase in Hebrew is chazar b'cha. And it's used a lot in rabbinic literature. Chazar is to return, b'cha, return to yourself. And so chazar b'cha is an idiom for repentance. And some of these wonderful rabbinic parallels that kind of give you a little bit more of the culture, the folklore. Some are later than Jesus, some are closer to his time, that they give you Jewish thought. They tell you the emphasis on your relationship with God. I love the source in Sifrei, this very important commentary on the book of Deuteronomy, on Dvarim, which says, if you want to know the one who spoke and the world came into being, study the words of Agadah and cleave to his ways. Well, Agadah is storytelling with a message. That's what these parables are all about. You think that 1/3 of all the gospels are of sayings of Yeshua are in parables. So I often feel, of course, that if we don't understand the mashal, the Agadah, we won't understand the message of Jesus. But here in this dynamic parable, one of the most beloved stories of Yeshua that has such a powerful meaning of family reconciliation, showing this connection of our reconciliation with our Father who is in heaven, stresses this idea of coming to yourself. And I think it's really more of the later Hebrew, more from the Mishnaic times than the biblical Hebrew. I think that our gospel text was kind of later big biblical Hebrew, maybe like fragments we might find from Ben Sira or some of the later portions, but it's moving in the direction of the Mishnaic Hebrew. And this was always kind of our discussion sometimes in our study of the parables, a work that I had the privilege of doing with Shmuel Safrai and David Flusser, who guided me in my doctoral work, which I wrote at Hebrew University about parables, is did we look at idioms that were a little bit more from a Mishnaic Hebrew background or something more from a biblical Hebrew background. Robert Lindsey felt like it's more biblical, and Safrai was more of the thing, no, it's a little bit more Mishnaic. And I'm a little in between on that. I would love for us to discover, and I think it's quite likely that someday we will discover a fragment in a cave someplace with part of the Hebrew gospel. So far that hasn't happened. People ask me sometimes, well, where is the Hebrew gospel? Well, I would say, I've got my text I love to study. This is a synopsis of the gospels, the Greek gospels. I'd say it's right here in this text. You can see it and hear it behind the Greek text. I love the way that the famous Jewish scholar, very influential philosopher Martin Buber actually said, when I put my hand over my ear and listen to Jesus speaking in the Gospels, I can hear him speaking Hebrew. And he made the statement that Yeshua was, or he said, Jesus probably speaking in German, he's saying, Jesus is my elder brother. He said in German, seeing this connection, the family connection. And of course, I think especially in Israel and other places, we see this greater willingness or even a robust desire sometimes to say, Jewish scholars that are not believers, but they'll say, Jesus is of our nation. We need to see his contribution to our studies.
Let's take a look at the next slide. In figure 150, you show variations of arrangement between Luke and Mark. What is the significance of this?
One of the other core issues in synoptic studies is the interconnection between the outline, the arrangement. And often the claim is made that Mark is the outline. He's the first gospel, and he's shortest. And also the Matthew, Mark, and Matthew and Luke are following the outline of his Gospels. And one of the things we're seeing in this variation between Luke and Mark is something that scholars talk about a lot is what we call the Lukan travel narrative, where Luke shows Jesus going some areas where is not described in Mark and on his journey to Jerusalem. And we also see some variations in the arrangement. My friend Malcolm Lowe, and there's been some other scholars discuss this, have said, well, the argument from order is a little contrived because, you can make the argument from order to go, any direction. And if one gospel is a little bit shorter, it might have the appearance of having a greater influence on the order than it actually did. We see that there seems to have been kind of a disordering of some of these stories, and it may be that there were collections. We don't have really good explanation for this. I'm not saying that I understand it fully, but it may be that there were certain collections of aspects of it. We feel like Luke had not only this longer gospel that had been translated literally from Hebrew into Greek, but he also had probably a condensed, a shortened version of that. So if you notice the way I'm talking, I don't really see a Q in this. What many people say, well, one of these sources is Q. If you want to see Q as the sayings of Jesus from Matthew and Luke that aren't contained in Mark, you can develop a gospel source. Some people have had a lot of studies about Q, but we kind of believed in our study in Jerusalem and the way that I've seen the Gospels as I've studied it, translated the New Testament now, published this New Testament translation, is that there's really a story of Yeshua's life that was being told. And I don't think that we see a lot of evidence that this Q source actually existed. Q meaning Quella in German for a source, maybe source. When I say that, they thought of it as a spring of water. Certainly there were important aspects of the sayings of Jesus, the Sermon on the Mount and Matthew's Gospel, I think bringing together these sayings, dominical sayings of the Lord, very powerful, very Hebraic. Sermon on the Mount has wonderful parallels to the rabbinic literature. The classic examination of this in German was by Hermann Strock and Paul Billerbeck. Probably Billerbeck was more involved in the actual research and the writing. Das Kommentar zum Neuen Testament aus Talmud und Midrash. When they came to Sermon on the Mount, I think they have like 1,000 pages. It's very long. I don't remember the exact number of pages. Very long because of so many powerful rabbinic sayings about humility, about loving God, loving your neighbor. This foundation. What I like to call is this ethical monotheism that flows from Jewish faith and practice into our Christian experience today. Now, I'm not from a Jewish background, but I've learned to love the faith of Jesus. This is one thing I see in our translation of the Newer Testament. It seems like for 2,000 years, Christian believers have been told that your faith in Jesus cancels the faith of Jesus. And what we're seeing and discovering this ethical monotheism and making an English translation of the New Testament that highlights the first century Jewish connections is that the faith of Jesus enriches, strengthens, enhances our faith in Jesus. And in fact, we have to have the faith of Jesus to understand and really go deeper into our faith in Jesus. I remember one discussion with quite prominent Jewish scholar, Jacob Neusner, who, I don't know, was talking to Christians. I think many Christians would agree what Professor Neusner said. quite a vivid character, but he said, "You take Jesus, I'll take Torah." And I just want to say, for real disciples of Yeshua, you don't have an option. If you walk with Yeshua, you have to embrace Torah. After all, Yeshua said, "I didn't come to destroy the law and the prophets." He didn't come to destroy. I like the way we translate it. Don't even begin to think that Yeshua came to destroy the Torah and the prophets, but he came to interpret them properly. So really, to fulfill Torah in this context of first century was to accurately interpret it so that it would have practical application, spiritual meaning, and you could live your life. It's kind of amazing to me how even today, modern scholars, if someone asked Yeshua a question in the Shabbat, is this permissible? Is this permissible? Is this okay to do on Shabbat? And they say, look at how legalistic these people were. Well, they're asking the right question, and they're listening to Jesus' answer. They're interacting with Yeshua. Yeshua's answers aren't saying, well, I'm here to cancel everything. He is saying, this is the right interpretation of Torah, and he's interacting with Torah Shabbal Pei. He's interacting with the traditional interpretations to show that, well, healing is saving of life on Shabbat. Pikuach Nefesh requires you to save life on Shabbat, and healing is acceptable, something that would be acceptable in all Jewish faith and practice today. If we would go to later compendiums of Jewish law, if we would go to Yad Chazakah, or you would see Mishnah Torah, you would see that healing is saving life. So this is something, and Yeshua's argued, there may have been those that, and I think they would probably have been more from the viewpoint of the Sadducees or even the Essenes, who were stricter, more literalists in their interpretation, who might not have agreed with that. But Yeshua was talking to people that were understanding what he said. But I'm just saying, in a Jewish context, to say, well, is this permitted? What's the right thing to do at this point? You have oral tradition interpreting the written Torah so that you can apply it, have the practical application, the deeper spiritual meaning, so that you can live your life in a way pleasing to the Lord.
So in figure 151, figure 3, page 151, I meant to say, you show a stemma proposed by a Jerusalem school. You have the Hebrew Evangelium, the top right there. And then you got Matthew using Mark using Luke in this figure. What is the first reconstruction, reorganized source text, and Greek translation? Like, what do those three things mean? Could you explain what those are to the audience?
Oh yes. I'm really glad that you're using the stemma that I outlined in my book, and did, in Jesus and Jewish parables went, into a lot of discussion of this because it's important for parable study. And I would say the Jerusalem Perspective, for instance, has an article written by Bob Lindsey, which pretty much follows this. May be also very good. And there's some others that maybe have slight variations, but what we saw when we say or evangelium, well, this is just saying the pre-gospel story. If we want to relate it to Papias, we want to say Irenaeus also, their origin, there's talks of a Hebrew gospel. And as I've said, some people want to say it's Aramaic. That's all right. But, here is a story of Yeshua's life. And I think it did have the birth narratives. Some parts of the birth narratives might even come from a gospel about John the Baptist. There's some issues there about the sources, but you've got, the birth, the baptism, you have this outline, you have the journey to Jerusalem. to fulfill what was spoken by the prophets. But you have an emphasis on teaching. You have an emphasis on parables. I sometimes feel like we have neglected the living Jesus by the death of Jesus. It seems like evangelical community at times want to talk so much about the death of Jesus, they don't want to let the living Jesus teach us. But we believe that this Hebrew or evangelium was literally translated into Greek. A good source to study this, we have many sources translated from Hebrew into Greek. The Septuagint, at an earlier time, but obviously gives us a lot of information and insight. We have some aspects of the Dead Sea Scrolls where we had Greek sources of, we didn't have a Hebrew undertext with the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls. We sometimes have fragments or Hebrew, and most of the Dead Sea Scrolls are Hebrew and not Aramaic. We have some examples of Aramaic and some from Eastern Aramaic or Western Aramaic. So all those things are aspects of it. But we have a Greek translation. But at some point, this Greek translation was reorganized and had a little different order. And we also feel that there was an effort to kind of reconstruct this. And that's what we call Luke's special source. So when Matthew and Luke agree, like 90% of the wording, they have high verbal agreement. We believe that both of them are drawing from this reorganized source text. When Matthew and Luke disagree in the double tradition, and there are some times when they don't agree. I think the Lord's Prayer would be an example of this, where Luke seems to be using the Lord's Prayer from the first reconstruction, and Matthew, in my view, is using the Lord's Prayer, better called the Disciples' Prayer, from the reorganized text. And then, Lindsey kind of debated, Bob Lindsey himself, I think, was debated with himself. We discussed this, whether Mark just used Luke. He felt like that you could see all of Mark coming from Luke with, this rewriting method. David Flusser, and I tend to agree with David Flusser on this against Bob Lindsey. I hate to, I love both of them very much, and both of them had a great influence on me. But David Flusser felt like that Mark also knew this reorganized text, and sometimes he had some good source material that he's drawing from this literal Greek translation. But what we do see is that Mark then is influencing Matthew. So when Matthew has Mark, the Markan cross factor comes in, and he will copy some aspects of Mark's text into what might have been a more historical, we see it as a little closer to that Hebrew or Evangelion. So the reorganized text, Matthew is being a little more influenced from Mark's writing, probably emphasizing the actions of Jesus. Church tradition, Papias again, says that Mark was in Rome. Maybe this was reaching a non-Jewish audience, which probably would be disconnected from the teachings of Jesus as much. I mean, I think there is a lot of Torah teachings in Matthew, Torah teachings in Luke. Also, we have some unique Lucan parables, unique Matthean materials. Mark himself has a parable that is unparalleled. He has a couple of parables, but for the most part, we see Mark not giving us very many parables. He feels like the parable of the sower is very important. And again, I think when we look at the parable of the mustard seed, and so we see a little bit more of the Markan additions to it. So that's what I see in this reorganized text. And I feel like, in my work with the Synoptic Gospels, it just kind of makes very good sense. I could go through and reconstruct all of these sources from the text that we have. And the work that David Biven is doing now with the Jerusalem perspective, the Jerusalem schools work, is kind of doing some more reconstructions of this and studying the Hebrew, the language. And a lot of this I did in my parables book, Jesus and his Jewish parables. We have some Hebrew reconstructions of some of these texts. And the Semitisms that we have. So I think we can see these different levels of the synoptic tradition unfolding in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And if we want to go behind them, what sometimes we call source analysis, source criticisms, analysis, study, what are the sources that they use? So in this way, we can understand the verbal identity between the three Gospels. Where they agree, there's uniformity. And then we can also find a divergence of wording sometimes and why one text is a little bit differently. And then if we're seeking that original first century Jewish context, we can use linguistic studies to go back to it. This is one area that I've worked on with our Newer Testament translation. We say it's very different from the normal translations that are out there, which have basically a two-step approach. They translate from Greek to English. But we have a three-step approach. We look at the Greek and we say, in an intermediate step, what did that mean in Hebrew? What did that mean to the Jewish audience? How did the disciples hear it? And then, and on occasion, even we might even do more of a Hebrew reconstruction as we're translating it into English. I'll give you an example when we have the Lord's Prayer text of a reconstruction. Opheto, it says, "Thy kingdom come." And the word "come," I believe in my study, was a way that the Greek text was translating the Hebrew word "himmelich," because in Hebrew, when you talk about causing to reign, or you talk about a kingdom reigning, almost always, it's quite frequent, you're using the three-letter root malach, mem, lamed, chaf, he reigns, and you put it in what we call the he field, to cause to reign, himmelich. So we talk about a king, Solomon, he's caused to reign, himmelich. So that if I'm going to do a Hebrew kind of reconstruction of what I think the Hebrew undertext was, I translated it Tamlich Malchutcha, and it better in English it's translated, continue establishing your kingdom, so that the kingdom is established and it's continuing to grow. But when we put it, thy kingdom come, it sounds a little bit more only temporal. It's in the future. And most of the time when we're talking about the kingdom, there is an existential reality. There's certainly a future aspect. I like the way that E. Stanley Jones said one time that when we're talking about kingdom, we're talking about God's presence working in our lives. We have to think both present and eternity simultaneously. So we have the present, but we also see eternity simultaneously when we're talking about Tamlich Malchutcha, continue establishing thy kingdom. So I think that's the way the disciples were hearing it. And today, when we say thy kingdom come, we're kind of putting it more only into the eschatological future in a temporal sense.
I want to talk about the stemma proposed by Jeremiah for a moment. So it's very similar to the diagram from Figure 3, which is your view, and he sees it a bit differently here. Very similar, but a bit differently. He's got the Q document there. There was no Q document in the previous diagram. Complexes of tradition, Luke's special source, but he's got Matthew in between Mark and Luke. So what do you think about this?
Yeah, Joachim Jeremias was a tremendous scholar. His book on the parables was kind of a classic, still used today in academic studies. One of his books, some of the, I think in German, was so good about the Luke's language and those things. But this stemma proposed by Jeremias, word stemma, we're saying, we're giving this kind of outline, the interconnections where the gospel text originated, this analysis of the sources, is pretty much the traditional view. I mean, this is a two-source theory, Mark and Q. So that's the two-source hypothesis. So he believes that Mark composed the gospel from complexes of tradition. Sometimes people want to emphasize this oral traditions, that there were these oral stories and they circulated at a time. I do think if we would study, a book like Gerhardson's Memory and Manuscript, where he has studied the oral tradition of the Jewish people, even the Mishnaic sources, Mishnah, the oral Torah. And there are other very good studies on this. It would help you maybe understand how some stories were preserved. But I think if we really look at this, we came to the conclusion that these sources were early written down. And so Jeremiah sees these complexes of stories, probably from oral tradition, some of them being written down. Mark is writing them. And then there was a saying source. So logia in Greek refers to sayings most of the time. Logia can also mean events, but here they're saying that the sayings of the Sermon on the Mount, the Sermon on the Plain, the parables of Matthew and Luke together, that would form another source, a saying source. So it's an easy way to isolate materials. It doesn't appear in Mark. So then scholars say, well, these scholars, Matthew and Luke, were using Mark and were using Q. And then generally they'll say, well, there were some sources, special sources that Luke had that weren't connected to Mark or to the Logia source. And a lot of times, I can't remember now what Jeremiah does with some unique Matthew material. I don't know, might be that he would have Matthew's special source. But when Jeremiah was talking about, Luke's special source, he's thinking about the travel narrative, a little different outline, also some sayings. And he did some serious work, linguistic studies of Luke's gospel. And I think that was one of the aspects of his study of the parables that made it very esteemed or by some scholars, because he did try to do Aramaic reconstruction sometimes of language. And so, he followed the Aramaic theory of gospel origins and, saw that. But you have the two source hypothesis. Most of our commentaries, Bible scholars that are working today, use some form of the two document hypothesis. They believe that Matthew and Q form the basis of Matthew and Luke, and they see Mark as being the first of the three synoptic gospels. Now there are some scholars who have argued for Matthean priority, and they have certain adherents as well. And I could see why that's attractive, because in our scenario, we see Matthew perfectly preserving many of these Hebraic sayings of Jesus, because he's connected to the Evangelion, the Proto-Hebrew document. And Luke also has access to that document. I would say Luke edits it a little bit more. For instance, Matthew almost always says, Malchut Shamayim, the kingdom of the heavens. Actually, in Greek, it's plural. Generally, in English or Greek, we wouldn't always say heavens in the plural, but in Hebrew, the word Shamayim is plural. Luke prefers the term Malchut Tutheu, the Malchut HaElohim, that is He Basileia Tutheu in Greek, the kingdom of God. It is interesting that we do have a rabbinic parable in the Mechilta that we have one manuscript. It's a variant reading, but it's probably the better reading. But there we have a manuscript that has Malchut Elohim. But that's very unusual, the kingdom of God in a rabbinic source instead of Malchut Shamayim. Almost always in the rabbinic sources, the better readings, almost always you have Malchut Elohim, Malchut Shamayim, the kingdom of heaven. Of course, after you pray the Shema, Shema Yisrael Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. You recite that blessing. Baruch Shem Kavod Malchuto Le'olam Va'ed. Blessed the honorable name. His kingdom is forever and ever. Or some translate, blessed is the name. His glorious kingdom is forever and ever. But you've got the idea that the kingdom is present. This was prayed on Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, after forgiveness. The priest had offered sacrifice, sprinkled the blood on the mercy seat. He comes out, he utters the holiest name of God, Yod, Hey, Vav, Hey, and the whisper, people fell on their faces. Baruch Shem Kavod, Malchuto L'olam Va'ed. Blessed is his honorable name. His kingdom is forever and ever. This kingdom of glory, his name of glory, the heaviness, the glory of the name, and the kingdom is being realized at this moment of forgiveness, reconciliation, bringing the Shekhinah, the divine glory, the presence into the lives of the people. So I think there's an aspect of the kingdom that was often present. In fact, I think the kingdom of heaven, many times in rabbinic sources, is referring to obeying God, following God as king, and is often associated with the Shema, where you are praying this prayer and you're rejecting idolatry, you're embracing ethical monotheism, you're embracing the oneness of God, and that can be the first step to entering into the life of obedience, which is the second part of the Shema, if you will diligently hearken to these words. So in the Mishnah Brachot, we have these stories about how the disciples would say the Shema to receive the kingdom of heaven. And this was, a very powerful foundation. C.H. Dodd even wrote about this in his book, The Parables of the Kingdom, and had an understanding of this to some degree, and worked on this in trying to develop a theory of realized eschatology, which I critique in my books, trying to bring some of the strong points and the weaker points of it. But I think it's a theory that needs to be reevaluated really today.
Let's take a look at the next slide. And so on page 154, you talk about the cursing of the fig tree, and that it may be a marked adaptation of Luke's parable of the fig tree in Luke 13, 6-9, with possible influences from other Jewish sources. Matthew is very similar to Mark's version. So are you saying that Mark is getting his version from Luke, and then based on your diagram from earlier, Matthew knows Luke, but he's taking it more from Mark in this parable?
Yes, Jacob, and I'm wondering if I would write the same thing today. I think this is very interesting that we have a cursing of the fig tree. Sometimes you ask, well, why didn't the Lord just say bear fruit? And of course, there are those that are, connecting the symbolism with maybe the nation of Israel. Something I think is a little problematic in this context. I think when Jesus says there's a nation that bears fruit, you have to remember that the word nation is only used of Israel. You don't have a nation of Gentiles. Heathens are the nations, the umot olam, the goyim, but the nation is the nation of Israel. But you have in the Hebrew scriptures a change in leadership. You have a corrupt priesthood that was the Sadducees connected to the Romans. And, I think we see a lot of collaboration there historically. The Sadducees were very much despised by the Romans. Today, sadly, I think when we say the word Pharisee, we only think of hypocrites. I have a different translation for the word Pharisee in the Newer Testament, which I think is far better, because today when we look at the word Pharisee and identify it as a hypocrite, we don't understand the Jewish context, because the Pharisees were considered to be spiritual leaders. And so take a saying of Jesus, like, unless your righteousness exceeds the righteousness of the Pharisees, you will not enter into the kingdom of heaven. Well, that saying is an important saying of Christ, of Mashiach, Yeshua, is kind of made meaningless because everybody thinks, well, it's really easy to be more righteous than those Pharisees. They were hypocrites. However, if you translate it more as they heard it, unless your righteousness exceeds the righteousness of the spiritual leaders, you will not enter into the kingdom of heaven. Well, we have spiritual leaders that are pretenders. We translate hypocrite as pretenders or hypocrites. So I think that brings it all together. So here, you're going to have a change of leadership. You're going to have a restoration of the nation, spoken of in Acts chapter 1. And but you wonder linguistically when you see how Mark can creatively use a Targumist method. So we have the fig tree we have the tree that doesn't bear fruit in Luke 13, and then it needs to be fertilized and given another year. Give more time. There's that sense of grace, and then we have the fig tree when it's blossoming. We feel like the fig tree may have been more of a sense that the evil, the rejection, the corruption, what we call in Hebrew sources the sinat chinam, the baseless hatred of the people, but this corrupt temple leadership that's criticized by spiritual leaders, Pharisees, Yeshua, and many others of the time. A collaboration with the Roman, you could even call them an occupying source. Forces for Rome, the Pax Romana, the peace of Rome, which was administered by the sword with cruel, brutal violence. So this is going to fade. They are going to come and destroy the temple. And so you've got this sense of prophetic urgency, if you will respond, just as Jeremiah the prophet, was urging the people to respond to the message in a spiritual sense for spiritual revitalization. People could maybe prevent this disaster or even be spiritually prepared, of course, to endure. And Yeshua gave in his prophecy advice or wisdom on how to be close to the Lord, even in the time of adversity. So I think in this part of the book, I'm discussing this, some of the possibilities that we see in interpretation. I think what Dr. Lindsey would probably lean more toward this, what I wrote on page 154, but at times I feel like what David Flusser was saying, that maybe Mark had a connection to this other source or other sources. So we have to see them. And I'm just sharing a little bit more about how we view this, because I think some of these elements of New Testament studies tend to flow into this replacement theology idea. So Jesus cursed Israel. He cursed the fig tree. Well, actually, what we're seeing is that he was longing for spiritual revitalization, and he wasn't cursing the nation, because he says the nation has to be Israel, will be bearing the fruit, but we're going to have a change of leadership. And of course, he is talking about himself in the parable of the only son, where he says this son, the owner of the vineyard has one son, and he will be the one that will ultimately be the rock. If you fall on that rock, you'll be broken. If the rock falls on you, you'll be crushed. In any case, the rock remains. The stone, Evan Masu Abonim, the stone which the builders rejected, has become the chief cornerstone. So Yeshua was actually prophesying that even in the death of the son, there is a future restoration. And he's talking about the movement and showing himself. So I think with that, we would see, much different view than this thing that Jesus cursed Israel. Of course, when we go to Revelation chapter 21, we see not only the 12, I like to call them authoritative emissaries, the 12 apostles, the 12, those that were with Yeshua very close, but we also see the 12 tribes of Israel. And in Revelation chapter 5, Yeshua comes as the Lion of Judah, the Tzimach David. I mean, there is a sense of connection to the people, the whole story of Israel. You know, you have to begin with Genesis, as we're talking about, with Joseph forgiving his brothers, and we have to see Yeshua bringing the ultimate reconciliation, restoration, the triumph of the kingdom of God, the goodness of God, the goodness of God's people, overcoming the dark forces of evil, these spiritual forces that seem to overpower us sometimes. So there's a spiritual conflict there that we see in the apocalyptic, the unveiling of God's higher plan and strategy with, but Yeshua has a very Jewish role, and it's very connected to the tribe of Judah, the line of Judah. So I think it's a little hard to, follow through with this replacement theology idea. We have in seminaries epistemology, eschatology, ecclesiology. We have all kinds of, in our system, and these are really important aspects. What is our basic knowledge? How do we see our connection with the church and the people of God and the congregation? All these things are important, but it's amazing when you think that Israel is mentioned 2,400 times in the Hebrew scriptures and nearly 80 times in the New Testament. And we have the disciples asking Yeshua in Acts 1, will you at this time restore the kingdom to Israel? And Yeshua doesn't say, you're all wrong. That's not my plan. Israel is no more. We've replaced Israel. But he says, there's times and season given to the Father. It's in the Father's hands. So, but to understand the end of the story, we have to see Israel. What I'm saying is, if we have the ecclesiology, maybe we need to have an Israelology that sees Israel as vital in the scriptures, and that there's an entity of Israel. There's an entity of the believers of Yeshua, and there's some overlap there, but there is this movement, a higher strategy of bringing reconciliation to the world. Of course, I believe the Apostle Paul really stressed that in Corinthians, where he said we are emissaries, some say ambassadors for Christ. We are the Messiah's ambassadors, being ministers, servant leaders, bringing reconciliation, reconciling people to God, reconciling people with one another. And today, with this, I think what we see, such a tremendous increase of hatred, animosity, even a lack of just basic decency or civility, and where we're calling each other's names. We're not looking at each other as being created in the image of God, or being willing to listen to another viewpoint, or maybe to debate in a way that would bring greater truth or practicality to solve problems. I like the way that we say in Hebrew, there's a machloket l'shem shamayim. Machloket is the argument. And very recently, Gutman, very fine Jewish scholar in Israel, biblical scholar, he was saying that really the essence of Jewish faith and practice is the machloket, because we want to have a dialogue, we want to have a debate, we want to have a discussion where Hillel and Shammai present their views, but they can come together to maybe find a way that will bring unity. And so I think when we say a machloket l'shem shamayim, there is an argument for the sake of heaven. If we can listen to one another, esteem one another, recognize that each is creating the image of God. So instead of sinat chiram, this baseless hatred, or it just seems today, sometimes people feel like they're virtuous for who they hate, for whom they hate. If they hate the right person, they are consider themselves so good. And of course, when we read the Gospels, the story of Israel, the story of Jacob, the story of Judah and his brothers, Joseph forgiving his brothers, you're seeing this sense of, well, it's really a machloket l'shem shamayim. We need to have argument, discussion, but it should be for the sake of heaven. It should be where we really can love one another, understand one another, respectfully disagree, and try to work together for the common good for all of us.
Look at the final slide, the parables of the mustard seed and leaven. Matthew 13:31-33, Mark 4:30-32, Luke 13:18-21. The parables of the mustard seed and the leaven are partner illustrations. Both of the parables appear in the Gospel of Thomas, but in different contexts, Logia 20 and 96. However, these parables were probably originally connected with one another and employed to illustrate the same theme. In the bottom here, you're talking about Vincent Taylor, even referred to Matthew as being viewed correctly as a conflation of Mark and Q. And whether Matthew should be understood as being based upon a Q document may be questioned, but he seems to have a source that closely resembles Luke and also betrays the influence of Mark. Are you suggesting here that Matthew could have gotten his version of the parable of the mustard seed from Luke, and it kind of ignores Mark on this instance?
Yes, this is a very important twin parable, and Mark does not have the parable of the leaven. And I think Jacob has have to make one small observation here in relation to this, because often New Testament scholars have argued that one of these parables is original and the other one is fabrication of the other one. For instance, the lost sheep, the lost coin. Well, some scholars argue, well, the lost sheep is the original, and others, the lost coin is original. But what we discover, especially when we're studying rabbinic parables, and what we came to really recognize as very valuable in the study of parables in the Jerusalem approach, was that Jesus often used twin parables, dual parables. And we find this in rabbinic literature. Many times we'll find rabbis who give two similar parables in order to drive home the point. And so I think both of these parables, the leaven and the mustard seed, show a progressive growth of the kingdom. I know that very famous parable scholar, New Testament scholar, he also wrote on parables, but he's mostly known for his teaching on the kingdom, for giving us this phrase, already but not yet. The kingdom is already but not yet, I think, is the way that he would emphasize the not yet aspect. And I would prefer to say the kingdom is already and into the future. The kingdom is right now and into the future. And so here you've got progressive growth. So Weiss and other scholars have tried to say, well, the kingdom has a small beginning, it has a sudden end. That they emphasize, well, there's a sudden end. The great mustard tree, the leaven, it's suddenly growth. But in your asking of the synoptic analysis, Mark has the phrase, the smallest of all the seeds on earth. And when we look at Matthew, he also has the phrase, the smallest of all seeds. He doesn't have the part of earth. So my feeling would be, when we're looking at this, and as I was trying to explain in the book, is that this is the cross factor. Matthew is picking up the smallest of all seeds. But when I read the parable in Luke, it's what we call this a buildup. Your Hebrew kind of started with this. What is the kingdom like? Mashallah, what do we compare the kingdom to? It's like this small mustard seed, and it grew. There's one action, and became a tree, and the birds of the air made nests in its branches. So it's like this progressive growth, and it's emphasizing the growth. And similar, Hebrew is concise. It doesn't have a lot of adjectives or it stresses action, growth and action. So what shall I compare the kingdom of God? Is like leaven. A woman hid it in 3 measures of flour until it was all leaven. So you see this tremendous growth. And of course, there's wonderful parallels to the force of leaven. Leaven was important in rabbinic Jewish thought. Sometimes it is even compared to the evil inclination, the Yetzer Hara, which is powerful and overwhelms somebody. But the leaven's power is also compared to Torah study. It says if you study Torah, even if you continue sinning, the leaven, the Sa'or Shabbat, the leaven that's in it, the Word of God, the study of Torah, Torah learning will be so powerful that it will lead you into a right relationship with God. See, Torah is compared to shalom. There's nothing more powerful than peace in there. We have a lot of rabbinic teachings of shalom, shalem, wholeness, completeness. Well, if you give a soft answer that turns away wrath, if you forgive when somebody hates you, when you turn the other cheek, you go the second mile, you're releasing this force of shalom. It's the force of the kingdom. Jesus talks about it here in this context as the force of the kingdom, of course. But the shalom in the rabbinic literature is that shalom is strong like leaven, and it will leaven the whole lump. So there's this force of leaven. So I think that these illustrations are very good for us to understand the synoptic interrelationships. In this case, I would say you can, if you're just looking at it linguistically, thinking of which version can kind of link you up with this Hebraic undertext. All of them are good Greek, but you would see how Luke's gospel goes in this progression and has the dual parables. Matthew also has the dual parables. When we talk about the double tradition, Matthew 13:33 is very similar to Luke 13:20 through 21. I mean, the double tradition. Mark didn't write the parable of the leaven. Matthew and Luke agree with one another. But when you look at Matthew 13:31 through 32 with the parable of the mustard seed, Matthew seems to be taking some elements of Mark's version and incorporating them into his story. And in that way, I think he is being a little bit more on the Greek side. Well, we're going to talk about the seeds. We're going to talk about the greatest of the shrubs. So Mark's parable of the mustard seed is the longest of the parables. Luke's is the shortest, and Matthew is in between with some of the elements of Mark. So if you look at the stemma that we've developed in our study based a lot on language as well as the interconnections, this parable illustrates the stemma very well, I think.
Some scholars that say that the Q document didn't exist, like James Edwards, for example. You mentioned James Edwards.
Yes.
And he still refers to the text as the double tradition or double tradition source. Do you think that a text did exist that is a source for the double tradition, or maybe there was multiple texts that were sources for the double tradition?
Yeah, I mean, there is sometimes a temptation in synoptic theories, to multiply sources, and of course, I think most scholars will talk about a special source for Luke, a special source for Matthew, because they have some unique materials that we haven't talked about as much in our discussion today. But the idea of the Q source, they see it. I think we're better to try to see a narrative, and that's what Lindsey made me see a little bit more. And I've got to say that when I went to began my studies in Jerusalem with these things, I had education in the States, of course, and the other way. I mean, I was pretty sure that Mark had to be the first of the Gospels. I didn't know Hebrew that well. I began to learn Hebrew, and I was fairly fluent in modern Hebrew, but to get the linguistic background. And I started studying Greek before I started studying Hebrew. I think Greek is very important. I love Greek. I love the biblical languages. And in our classes, Jacob, I just have to think about how it was to work with Professor David Flusser at Hebrew University. Our classes were conducted in modern Hebrew. And, you would think you would just be using a modern Hebrew translation of the New Testament, since these are Israelis studying it. No, we had to use the Greek text. And Flusser was always translating, trying to go from Greek into Hebrew. And we're trying to think, well, especially with the life of Jesus. I did a lot of studies with him and the Apostolic Fathers. He loves teaching the Apostolic Fathers, which were Greek, and we would study the Greek and discuss it in modern Hebrew. But when we're studying the Gospels, you would see these Semitisms, things like he came to himself, or Avinu Shabbat I mean, very powerful in Matthew's version of the Lord's Prayer. So to me, I can see Luke in this reconstructed text taking Abba, just Father, in Father in heaven. And then he has the word sins instead of the words debts. Forgive us our sins, which is more of the spiritual application, but it's a good translation or understanding of the Hebraic, the language of chov, which is in Hebrew and also used also in Aramaic a lot for the idea of sin or an offense or an obligation, something that you owe someone. But it does have that idea of sin. Well, I think Luke is using this reorganized text at that point, and his text is very different from Matthew. But there are times, and that's what I would say, there are some texts in the double tradition where Matthew and Luke aren't quite as uniform. And in those times, we believe that Luke was using the reorganized text. So I think when you put it that way, you don't really need to have Q, and it may not be, to make more sources than you need. You want to see these sources. And I think Lindsey, pretty much made some convincing discussions that there was kind of an interconnection between them. So I like, the only description we have of how the Gospels were made is given to us by Luke. And we should listen to Luke because he knows more about it than anybody. But he would say that, many have sought to write this. And he uses actually the Greek word for hand, that they were writing the Gospels. And then he says, I've also followed the eyewitnesses. And I would say the eyewitnesses are like these oral traditions, and we have the written sources. And it seems like when he says they're in sequence, it's like the interconnection between them. So the interconnection between them, I think, forms kind of this narrative where there's an interrelationship, a chain of traditions, and probably this reorganized text have followed some type of a narrative like that. And we think what we call the proto-narrative, or after we had a literal Greek translation from Hebrew, we had a reorganization of the text. And that's what Luke and Matthew knew. And I'm thinking today with Flusser that probably Mark knew that as well and used it sometimes. But Mark, I think we have evidence that Mark knew Luke. And, some people are saying, probably reading that same evidence that Luke knew Mark, and again, like when you look at the order, you could say, well, the order came from Mark, you can say it came from Luke, you can say it came from Matthew. I mean, it's kind of a circular argument when you're talking about order. But, and of course, the shorter gospel looks a little bit more like he's influencing people. But even so, I think you see this basic outline of Luke, and Matthew is being influenced a little bit more from Mark's narrative in that the way that it's unfolding. But all of these sources are telling us who Yeshua is, and they're leading us on the journey to Jerusalem. And I want to get to Jerusalem. I want to get to the resurrection story. The tomb is empty. Yeshua has risen. But I also want to say, well, Yeshua was teaching us how to live, and we need to, we're on the journey to Jerusalem. We still need to hear the parables. We need to hear the ethical monotheism, the practical application of it, and especially today as we've been sharing this very important message of reconciliation. And I hope that helps a little bit. You're really pressing my buttons, Jacob. I'm sorry you get me excited about these things. This is very important. Thank you for this good question.
Of course. My final question for today is, when would you date the Gospels?
Very, very important question. Um, the evidence that some people use for dating the Gospels after the destruction of the temple in 70, for instance, is maybe in the parable where it describes Jerusalem being destroyed. You know, we look in Luke 19, it says siege works are laid around it. I think there was an article by C.H. Dodd that pointed out that the same terminology is used in Ezekiel. Well, if you read Ezekiel and it mentioned siege works around Jerusalem, you could say, well, Ezekiel was written after 70 AD. It seems like Jesus as a prophet would probably cite Ezekiel or other sources that would show Jerusalem had been destroyed. It could happen again. Or so, I think we have to have a little bit more sensitivity to the text and history and saying that, elements like that show definitely that the Gospels were written after 70 AD. John A.T. Robertson, there's other scholars who have argued that maybe the Gospels were written before 70. Some people say after 70. I remember very clearly discussing this with David Flusser as an Orthodox Jew who wasn't trying to, uphold an evangelical position or a liberal position, but just as a historian of religion, someone who studied these texts for many years and analyze the sources, he would say, well, there's no reason to date the Gospels after 70. I think the argument that if they were written after 70, there would be a much greater emphasis on the catastrophe of the destruction. And of course, we have a lot of rabbinic stories that mention the destruction of Jerusalem. Malcolm Lowe one time said that he felt like the impetus or the desire to write the sayings of Jesus would have happened even in the war with Antipas, 39 or 40. Why wouldn't the disciples want to write down the Hebrew sayings of Jesus or feel like they needed to compose a Hebrew gospel early? And I think the fact that we have evidence from the Greek text, the linguistic analysis of it, that there could have been a Hebrew undertext or a Semitic undertext, indicates that this was early. And I know we don't always understand oral tradition. Sometimes people feel like if it's oral tradition, maybe they'll be changing the wording of it or a little bit. But in an oral society, the oral text is as a written text. You can't change an oral source. It is written in the hearts of men, and there is a great methodology in preserving oral literature and oral history and an oral text like this. But I think the way that Lindsey shows us a dynamic of the Gospels. So to me, it makes better sense to see the Gospels written as before the destruction of the temple. Is it possible there might have been an interpolation about the end times? Well, that's something we have to deal with in our manuscript tradition. We are so fortunate in New Testament studies to have over nearly 6,000 manuscripts, textual witnesses to the Newer Testament. This aids us in our translation. And so I think sometimes we have to use a better analysis of the textual evidence, especially considering some of the references to Jewish tradition, some of the connections to the language of Hebrew as we're analyzing the text. And some of those things might also be the case. We know that even the testaments of the 12 patriarchs, we probably see some interpolations on the Greek versions of it. But on the whole, I think to see the Synoptic Gospels being very close to the time of the life of Jesus, being written by emissaries that were very much wanting to preserve it. I think it is interesting that some scholars seem to feel like that the early followers of Yeshua had no desire to accurately preserve his text, or that they're changing it frequently with trying to rewrite, add exhortations or something. I think there would have been a desire to accurately preserve the sayings of Yeshua and to pass them on. And I think we can see that in the Gospels, so that when we use a good linguistic method and we study these texts, we can know better the words of Yeshua from the time, and we can see the practical meaning, the spiritual application that flows from his teachings, and a challenge for us today. It's so relevant today, what Yeshua is teaching. It has application. And of course, the essence of the kerygma, the proclamation of the kingdom, the proclamation of the death, burial, resurrection of Yeshua, calling for disciples. Yeshua told us to go and make disciples. He had the message of the kingdom, a way of life, a way that enters into a deeper spiritual experience, to have that deeper spiritual walk based on Torah, based on the kingdom, based on community, the people of Israel, the community of believers where we gather together and grow together. So we have some really powerful elements that go back to the early sources of the Gospels. It's one thing to say maybe the composition of our Gospels is closer to the destruction or before the destruction of Jerusalem, but I think some of these earlier sources of our Gospels are much earlier.
Well, thanks for joining me today, Professor Young. And I thank everybody else that participated in the live chat and their continued support of the channel.
Well, thank you, Jacob. It's been a great honor to be with you. Thank you for asking such wonderful questions, and just enjoyed having a chance to dialogue with you today. Thank you for this opportunity. Blessings to you.
Thank you. And you too. Hello, viewers. Thanks for watching the video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during a live stream. Thank you.